You're listening to an African Elements top news story for June 9th, 2025. Please visit our website at africanelements.org for more daily news. LA National Guard Deployment, a deep dive into policing protests, by Darius Spearman, africanelements.org. The streets of Los Angeles recently witnessed the sight of National Guard troops, a strong reminder of how quickly civil unrest can bring military presence into everyday life. This deployment, undertaken in response to protests tied to immigration enforcement, has stirred deep concern and drawn unsettling comparisons to a dark chapter in American history, the Kent State tragedy. For many within our African American and African diaspora communities, such events resonate with a painful past, echoing generations of encounters with state power and the use of force during protests. Understanding this recent deployment requires a close look at its context, its historical echoes, and its potential impact on Black and Brown people who often stand at the forefront of social justice movements. In addition, it is important to examine the reasons behind these protests, the role of federal agencies like ICE, and the legal frameworks that permit military forces to operate within our cities. The implications stretch far beyond the immediate clashes, touching upon issues of civil liberties, community trust, and the delicate balance of power between federal and state authorities. Examining this scenario through the lens of lived experience for Black and Brown people offers crucial insights into the stakes involved. The Trump administration recently sent 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles. This significant deployment happened after clashes between federal immigration agents and local protesters. The stated purpose was to support federal law enforcement and to address violence occurring near immigration raid locations. Such a move immediately signals an escalation, transforming civilian issues into a matter of military presence. Moreover, this deployment occurred despite strong objections from California Governor Gavin Newsom. Governor Newsom argued that bringing in the National Guard would only increase tensions and erode the public's trust in government institutions. For people with historical experiences of excessive force, particularly in Black communities, the sight of uniformed troops on American streets often brings more fear than reassurance. This is also why understanding the reasons behind these protests and the role of the involved agencies becomes critically important. This National Guard deployment in Los Angeles was a part of a wider effort by the Trump administration to severely crack down on unauthorized immigration. This approach ignited increased tensions and protests, especially in California. A key player in these operations is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, a federal law enforcement agency under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. ICE's primary duty involves protecting the United States from cross-border crime and undocumented immigration by enforcing many federal laws. The agency employs over 20,000 people and manages an annual budget of approximately $8 billion, making it a very large law enforcement body. Its Enforcement and Removal Operations (ERO) section manages the detention and deportation of individuals believed to be present in the U.S. without proper authorization and who might pose a threat to public safety. The protests largely stem from objections to these practices, which many see as harsh or unjust, particularly actions like family separation or widespread deportations. In some confrontations, tear gas has been used, further escalating the conflict between authorities and protesters. For our communities, understanding what violence is in this context typically means assessing threats to public safety, like property damage or physical harm, which authorities use to justify such deployments. The comparison of the Los Angeles National Guard deployment to the Kent State tragedy is profound and holds deep meaning for many communities, especially African Americans. This historic event took place on May 4, 1970, when National Guard members opened fire on unarmed student protesters at Kent State University. These students were demonstrating against the Vietnam War and President Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia. Sadly, the confrontation resulted in the deaths of 4 students, marking a horrifying moment in American history. Furthermore, the Kent State shootings are widely seen as a turning point, symbolizing governmental overreach and the extreme risks of using military force against civilian protests. The anger and further protests that followed across the United States underscored the importance of peaceful assembly and questioned the role of military involvement in domestic law enforcement. For Black Americans, who have faced the National Guard and other uniformed forces during critical moments like the Civil Rights Movement, the memories of Kent State reinforce the urgency of protecting civil liberties and ensuring accountability for those who wield state power. This legacy continues to shape how communities of color perceive deployments like the one in Los Angeles. The National Guard operates as a military force that a state governor can deploy domestically during emergencies or civil unrest. Its primary function in law enforcement is to provide support to state and local authorities. However, the legal framework governing this is complex. The Posse Comitatus Act generally prevents federal military forces from engaging in civilian law enforcement duties, but there are specific exceptions for certain emergencies or situations authorized by federal law. Governor Newsom's strong opposition to the National Guard deployment in Los Angeles highlights the ongoing tension between state and federal authority when it comes to controlling military forces within a state. Governors typically have significant authority over their state's National Guard units, and federal deployments without their consent can lead to disagreements due to differing priorities or legal concerns. When military forces are introduced, particularly in communities that have historically experienced over-policing and state-sanctioned violence, it can profoundly disrupt community relations and worsen existing mistrust. Local law enforcement agencies often prioritize community policing and fostering beneficial relationships, efforts that can be undermined by the presence of a militarized force. The recent National Guard deployment in Los Angeles raises serious concerns about increased tensions and the appropriate role of military forces in domestic law enforcement. There are legitimate fears that if public clashes continue, even more significant military involvement, such as the deployment of active-duty Marines, could be mobilized. This escalation of force is especially concerning for African American communities who have historically been targets of heightened surveillance and militarized responses during times of protest or civil unrest. Historically, the National Guard has a lengthy record of involvement in civil disturbances. For instance, between 1965 and 1971 alone, there were over 260 deployments to manage such situations. Many of these past deployments took place during the civil rights movement and anti-war protests, often leading to tragic outcomes for protesters and bystanders alike. These events underscore the critical need for careful consideration and restraint when deploying military personnel in civilian areas. While the recent scenario mentions a 2025 date, implying a future projection, the underlying concerns about the use of force and military presence in civilian affairs remain relevant and urgent. The National Guard itself has undergone significant changes over time. It has become a diverse force with nearly 20% of its members being women and approximately 25% identifying as people of color. While diversity within military ranks is a step forward, it does not lessen the historical anxieties or the potential for negative outcomes when troops are deployed against civilian populations. The legacy of racial injustice and the disproportionate impact of military force on communities of color emphasize the ongoing relevance of these conversations. The outcomes of such deployments can vary greatly. While some may help maintain public order, others can worsen tensions and erode trust, particularly when local law enforcement efforts are undermined. The scenario serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing challenges in balancing public safety with civil liberties. The deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles in response to protests against immigration enforcement is more than just a local news story. It is a moment that compels us to reflect on historical patterns of state-sanctioned force and their particular impact on marginalized communities. The comparisons to the Kent State tragedy serve as a stark warning about the potential consequences when military power confronts civilian dissent. For our African American and African diaspora kin, such deployments activate deep-seated anxieties rooted in centuries of fighting for freedom and safety against oppressive systems. Finally, understanding the intricate roles of agencies like ICE, the legal dance between federal and state authorities over military deployments, and the historical precedents of civil unrest are crucial steps. This understanding enables us to advocate more effectively for equitable treatment, robust civil liberties, and peaceful resolutions to societal disagreements. It is imperative that we continue to critically examine these events and push for policies that protect all people, ensuring that the lessons of history, especially those learned at such a great cost, are never forgotten and always guide our path forward. Copyright African Elements.